At long last, this episode is here. Dark Souls versus Skyrim, the Chosen Undead versus the Dragonborne. It's finally here. I've said this before, but I was genuinely more excited for this episode than I was for either of the Ballad episodes, except for maybe Bill versus Discord. I had just recently finished Elden Ring last year, so this came out at basically the perfect time. There was also a lot of build up to this episode, since not only was it one that had a pretty big cast episode, and being an episode that Liam really wanted to do, to the point where he compared it to Dio vs. Alucard, which is literally his magnum opus episode. But it was also another long-lasting legacy matchup between two really famous game franchises. And for me personally, there was a lot of build-up because, as I've said before in previous videos, two of my best friends are Skyrim and Souls fans respectively, and I was able to drag them into a call, and we all ended up watching the episode together, even though they don't really care about Death Battle as much as I do. So this episode, regardless of how good it was going to be something really special. But did it deliver on all the hype? Oh, absolutely. Starting off with the analysis, they were both really solid. It's always really interesting when a new franchise is brought into Death Battle, because it means the analysis is, by default, going to be really unique in its own way. This analysis honestly felt very similar to something like Goku vs. Superman, a rundown that feels like it's a love letter to both franchises, which, considering Liam wrote this, and he's a big Souls fan, I'm not really surprised. The rundowns are paced really well. They're able to balance story coverage and arsenal and feat coverage, like, surprisingly well. And the jokes all land well without sounding like they're trying to stay in touch. It's not like a how do you do fellow kids moment. A lot of the humor is improved thanks to the editing though. This episode was edited by a new editor named Parker. And while his editing style isn't as fluid or alive as something you'd see in previous seasons, or even in the last episode, Ant-Man vs. Adam, the editing is definitely more comedic based though, which honestly I'm down for, since the jokes in this episode are honestly really good, and the editing escalates it really well, especially with the Dragonborns. I had a smile on my face and was laughing throughout most of the rundown, but that's probably because I was also watching the episode with my friends for once, so that probably helped with my ability to laugh, I guess. But even besides that, the jokes were all really good. The cutaway gags were good, they weren't just like slapstick like usual. I do like the implication that Wiz's student loans were so bad that he had to sell his soul in order to cover the down payment, and I'm glad they didn't go with Boomstick just blowing up Wiz with the shout like I'm pretty sure everyone else expected them to. Overall, this rundown was really good, and probably one of my favorites in a long while. And the fight? Oh my god, where do I even begin? Everything about this fight is just breathtaking. The amazing backgrounds, the stunning effects, the absolutely immaculate track, the fluid and dynamic movements, the interesting exchanging of arsenals. Oh god!
Oh my god, he's so goddamn cool!
Okay, one thing at a time. Let's take this fight bit by bit. Starting with the visuals. This fight's lighting and visual effects are genuinely on par with Sauron vs. Lich King, which has some of the best visuals in the show in my opinion. Every single blast effect looks so incredibly stunning, everything from the fight only being illuminated by the bonfire, the various shout attacks and all the magic, to my second favorite shot in the fight with the Dragonborne summoning a storm and the Chosen Undead charges forward and summons two lightning bolts of his own, only to clash in a spectacular display of effects that levels the building they're in. It's all just great. The choreography is also stunning. Every attack feels like it has as much impact and weight as it should. The sword fighting is fluid and free of any jank. They get to use a decent variety of their arsenal, which is the big thing that I wanted from this matchup. Dragonborne gets to use various spells and magic, while the Chosen Undead gets to use his various weapons, along with a few magic spells, and they all interact in interesting ways. And while there isn't much comedy, the jokes that are in there are pretty good, and don't take away from the fight at all. The rolling joke in the beginning got a laugh out of me and my friends, and the following joke with the Chosen Undead taking an arrow to the knee also got a chuckle out of me. But I also find it funny how the Undead's response to his bow by pulling out his bigger bow as if to say, nice bow, mine's better by the way. Also, I don't know if this part was supposed to be intentionally funny, but I found the shot of the dragon getting shot through the freaking head kind of funny just because of how abrupt it was. The fight is also just shot beautifully. There was not a single bad shot in this entire fight, and each one should be studied in a freaking film class. All the sword fighting scenes are all one long shot without any cuts in between, and the references to both franchises with the way it's shot is just brilliant. Speaking of brilliant, the track is freaking outstanding. I didn't know that Brandon decided to get a bunch of Death Battle fans as part of a choir, but they all did a phenomenal job because this track is amazing. The way it complements the scene is spectacular, and it's just as much of a banger on its own. This is probably up there with Princess of Pride and Wings of Iron as one of my favorite tracks to ever come out of this series. It's just that good. Alright, so I've talked about the episode overall long enough. I need to talk about my favorite stretch of the animation, which is the ending. After the two clash with enough strength to level the freaking building they're in, they're both down to their strongest, or most iconic, weapon. The Moonlight Greatsword and the Dawnbreaker. The music fades out, the Chosen Undead grabs the Greatsword and assumes a pose that's a reference to the game, which I'm glad they showed in the rundown so I can understand it. The Dragonborne grabs his Dawnbreaker sword, and we get a cool shot of him staring down the undead. The two charge as the music swells to an amazing crescendo as we get one long shot of the two sword fighting. Undead puts the Dragonborne on the back foot as he prepares a shout, but the Undead uses a vow of silence and advances on the Dragonborne again, with the music everything's completely silent. Dragonborne gets the upper hand and stabs the Undead in the chest, and as he's pulling the sword out, the Undead grabs onto the sword and pulls it further into his chest to give him an opening, grabbing the Dragonborne by the neck and beginning to choke him, followed by his only spoken line in the animation that's really well delivered by Liam of all people. The Dragonborne responds by shouting in his face, then cuts him up a bit and knocks him to the ground. Now this is the part I get a bit confused by. I haven't played Dark Souls, and I know this is set at what's supposed to be the end of Dark Souls 1, but I don't really understand what's supposed to happen here. Mr. Tom Shock, the narrator, tells the Chosen Undead to claim the fire. He touches it and turns into a giant fire tornado, which the Dragonborne destroys with a single shout. He falls to the ground in a shot that lingered so much to the point where I thought the Chosen Undead was going to come back, but he didn't, and the fight ends with it zooming in on the Dragonborne's face and Mr. Tom Shock laughing in the background. It did feel kind of abrupt, unfortunately, but that's probably because of my lack of understanding of Dark Souls as a whole. But regardless of that, phenomenal ending. Do I have any real complaints? Besides that, this shot of the Dragonborne pulling out his bow looked kind of weird, and I thought the cut between the rolling gag and the next shot was weird, since did he roll behind him and the Dragonborne didn't notice him? Or was he just blind and didn't see him move around? It's whatever. That was weird, but besides that, I literally have no other complaints. Absolutely phenomenal fight. The conclusion also checks out. I didn't really know much about this matchup and how, fair it was, or what the general consensus was leading up to it outside of what was said in the cast episode about it. But I liked the "you died" meme at the beginning, and the logic made sense since the Dragonborne was just so much more powerful than the Undead in terms of stats and had a better supply of magic. It makes sense that he'd be able to overwhelm the Chosen Undead until he literally rage quit. Is that wrong? I don't know, but I don't really care either. As long as their research or conclusion isn't wrong by their own logic and rule set, I don't really care, as long as the argument is convincing and whatnot. It feels weird giving a 10 out of 10 to the second episode of the season, but you know what? That's what I'm giving it. This episode was absolutely spectacular, and I'm so glad it turned out as well as it did, since I was really looking forward to it. I'm struggling to even find any other negatives to give it. They'll probably come to me when I rank the season as a whole by the end of the year, but as of right now, it's amazing. Though it is a bit of a concern that they put an episode this good at the beginning of their lineup, because the rest of the season has a lot to live up to. I'm so glad that this episode turned out as well as it did, for Liam's sake as well, because he was also really excited about it, and I like Liam, he's cool. And he's 2 for 2 on his passion projects, Dio and Alucard, and now this. Now on to the next time. And honestly, I'm pretty excited. Not as much as I was for this episode, but I'm excited that Hunter x Hunter, let alone my favorite character from Hunter x Hunter, is finally getting onto Death Battle against a show and character I've never heard of before. Regardless, I'm still excited. In terms of what I want, just good conveyances of killer with speed, and I want Godspeed to have a real cool impact visually, and I want the lightning powers to look cool as well, since I like lightning powers. Anyways, that's all from me. I had a lot of fun watching this episode, and I think it's great. If you haven't watched it already, go give it a watch. I think you'll like it, especially if you're a fan of both franchises. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll always be terrible at writing outros.